5 o'clock in the evening, May 23, 1701. The tidal foreshore at Wapping, a few yards below Wapping Old Stairs, on the north bank of the Thames. The river is running low. The mud smells of horse waste and rotting fish and brackish salt water, and the smell carries in the heat. A crowd has been gathering on the embankment since noon. The condemned man is led down to the foreshore by the Admiralty Marshal, who carries the silver oar of office on his shoulder. The prisoner is drunk. The chaplain of Newgate, a clergyman named Paul Lorraine, will later record this with shock. The prisoner had been provided with quantities of rum from sympathetic hands during the slow procession across the city. The man's coat is fine wool. His wrists are still raw, where the irons were taken off an hour ago. His name is William Kidd. He was, until recently, the king's privateer. The hangman places the noose. The rope is tested. The cart is drawn forward. The trap goes. The man drops. The rope breaks. Captain William Kidd lands in the Thames mud. He is, briefly, alive. They drag him up the bank, fit him with a new rope, and hang him a second time. The body, when it stops moving, will be left where the tide can reach it for 3 low waters, then carried downriver and hung in chains at Tilbury Point as a warning to the merchant captains coming up the estuary. This is the last hour of Captain William Kidd's life. The men who sent him here are not on this beach. They are at their dinners in Lincoln's Inn and at the Admiralty. And one of them is the Lord Chancellor of England, who 6 years earlier signed the very commission that put William Kidd on this beach. This is Black Ensign, the real history of piracy, told from what the records actually say. To understand why Kidd is on the foreshore at Wapping and why the men who put him there are not, we need to go back 6 years. To a house on Dover Street in London in October of 1695. William Kidd is 47 years old, born in Greenock in Scotland. By trade, a privateer. He has spent the last decade in the Caribbean fighting the French for the English crown, and doing it well. He has a wife in New York, a house on Pearl Street, and a respectable Anglican pew at Trinity Church. He has come to London looking for a Royal Navy commission. He does not get one. What he gets instead, through the introduction of his fellow New Yorker Robert Livingston, is a meeting with the Earl of Bellamont, the Irish peer, about to be appointed governor of New York and Massachusetts. At Bellamont's house, Kidd is offered a different kind of arrangement. On October 10, 1695, articles of agreement are drawn up in Livingston's own hand. Kidd is to be the captain of a purpose-built privateering vessel. The vessel will hunt pirates in the Indian Ocean. The men named as the targets of the commission are real pirates listed on the document by name: Thomas Toost, John Ireland, Thomas Wake, William Mays. But behind Bellamont stand 4 other men. None of them sign the paperwork. Their interests are conveyed by intermediaries, by servants, by trusted city merchants who put their own names on the books in place of the principals. The principals are these: John Somers, Lord Keeper of the Great Seal of England, the most distinguished lawyer in the kingdom, the man who, 3 months later, will personally affix the royal seal to the commission that authorizes Kidd's voyage. Edward Russell, Earl of Orford, First Lord of the Admiralty, the hero of the naval action at Barfleur and La Hogue 3 years earlier, the man who, with one signature, can deploy or recall any warship in the King's fleet. Charles Talbot, Duke of Shrewsbury, Secretary of State for the Southern Department, King William's most trusted political advisor, and Henry Sidney, Earl of Romney, Master General of the Ordnance. These 4 men, together with Bellamont, are the inner ring of what later parliamentary investigators will call the Whig Junto. They are, between them, the Chief Law Officer of England, the Chief Admiralty Officer, the Chief Diplomatic Officer, the Chief Ordnance Officer, and a sitting colonial governor. The structure of the venture is this: the Crown receives 10% of any prize taken. Of the remainder, 60% goes to the noble backers. 15% goes to Kidd and Livingston between them. 25% goes to the crew. Customary privateering articles of the period give the crew around 60%. The Junto's articles have inverted the ratio. And the prize court system, in which an admiralty judge in London would normally adjudicate captures and skim a third for the admiralty's pocket, has been cut out entirely. Captures will be brought to Boston and adjudicated by Bellamont himself, as governor, sitting as his own prize court. Kidd signs. He signs a personal bond for £20,000, making himself liable in damages if no return comes in. A ship is purchased at Captain William Castle's yard at Deptford for £8,000. She is the Adventure Galley, 287 tons, 34 guns, 46 oars. The commission, under the Royal Seal of England, is signed by King William III on January 26, 1696. Over the next 20 minutes, I will show you how this voyage was constructed, where the gold actually went, and which London bankers were waiting at the other end of the Atlantic with their assay scales out. From the trial pamphlet printed by James Nutt in 1701, from the depositions taken before Bellamont in New York, and from the surviving ledgers of the Lombard Street goldsmiths, whose firms are still in business today. Before we go any further, if this is your kind of history, told from the records rather than the legend, subscribe. A new ensign goes up every week. Now, back to the Adventure Galley. The Adventure Galley left Deptford on April 6, 1696. She lost much of her original crew almost immediately to an aggrieved Royal Navy press at Greenwich, after Kidd's men, by his own later account, slapped their backsides at a passing king's yacht. Kidd recruited replacements in New York. The replacements were not the disciplined privateer crew of his Caribbean voyages. They were New York harbor men, and many of them had prior pirate connections. The voyage went wrong almost from the beginning. Off Madagascar, off the Comoros, off the Malabar coast, Kidd hunted and found nothing. He held station at the Bab el Mandeb in August 1697, hoping to intercept the Mughal Hajj convoy returning from Mecca. The convoy passed under the escort of an East India Company warship, and Kidd was beaten off without a prize. His crew began to mutiny. On October 30, 1697, his gunner, William Moore, confronted him on the quarterdeck. Kidd struck Moore on the head with an iron-bound bucket. Moore died the next day, his skull caved in above the left ear. This single act, recorded by the sworn deposition of every surviving witness, will be the only charge on which Kidd is ultimately hanged. 3 months later, on January 30, 1698, Kidd finally took his great prize, the Quetta Merchant, 400 tons, Armenian chartered, Indian-owned, sailed by an English captain carrying papers of safe conduct from the French East India Company. The French papers, in the legal logic of an English admiralty court, made her a legitimate prize of war. Kidd boarded her, took her cargo of silks and muslin and silver, and renamed her the Adventure Prize. By the time he reached the Madagascar pirate haven of Ile Sainte Marie in April 1698, most of his original crew had deserted to a real pirate named Robert Culliford, taking the bulk of the plunder with them. Kidd burned the rotting Adventure Galley to the waterline, transferred his remaining men and cargo to the Adventure Prize, and sailed for the Caribbean. He reached the West Indies in April 1699. He learned from the news that the Act of Grace just issued by King William, a general pardon for all Indian Ocean pirates, had specifically exempted 2 men, Henry Every and William Kidd. The Whig Junto had cut him loose. Now, while Kidd was doing all this, another English crew had already done what the syndicate had hired Kidd to prevent. In September of 1695, a month before the articles were even drawn at Bellamont's house, a Devon mariner named Henry Every had run down the Mughal pilgrim flagship Ganj-i-Sawai at the mouth of the Red Sea. The Ganj-i-Sawai was the largest ship in the Mughal fleet, 1,600 tons, 62 guns, 600 pilgrims, and 400 armed guards on board, returning from Mecca with a year's worth of port duties, trade goods, and offerings. A lucky first broadside from Every's Fancy carried away the Ganj-i-Sawai's mainmast. One of the defender's own cannons exploded on the gun deck, the powder smoke rolling thick across the upper rail. The pirates boarded. What followed over several days was, by every contemporary account that survives, an atrocity. Survivors testified before Mughal officials at Surat to rape, to torture inflicted, to extract the location of hidden valuables, to murder. The Mughal historian Kafi Khan recorded it in detail. The plunder taken from the Ganj-i-Sawai and her consort the Fateh Muhammad has been variously estimated. The East India Company's own insurance claim placed it at £325,000. The Mughal court's accounting placed it at £600,000. Approximately 500,000 gold and silver coins, plus jewels, plus a saddle reportedly encrusted with diamonds. Each man on Every's crew, after the division, walked away with about £1,000. A common seaman of 1695 could not have earned that in 100 years afloat. The diplomatic consequences arrived within months. The Mughal Emperor Aurangzeb arrested the English factors at Surat. He closed 5 East India Company factories. He threatened to extirpate the English presence in India altogether. Sir John Gayer, the company's president at Bombay, wrote in panic to the Lords of Trade in London on October 12, 1695. He wrote, and I quote from the surviving company correspondence, "It is certain the pirates, which these people affirm were all English, did do very barbarously by the people of the Ganj-i-Sawai and Abdul Ghafor's ship, to make them confess where their money was, and there happened to be a great Umbraw's wife, as we hear, related to the king, returning from her pilgrimage to Mecca, in her old age. She they abused very much." The Privy Council and the East India Company together offered a bounty of £1,000 on Henry Every's head, the first time the English crown had placed a price on a private mariner. Parliament declared the pirates hostis humani generis, enemies of all humanity. Every himself was never caught, but the gold was not lost. The gold went somewhere. And to understand where, we have to follow a smaller and quieter network. A network that ran from a fortified beach on a Madagascar island to the customs house at New York, to the assay shops of Lombard Street in London. Here is what you will not find in any conventional pirate history. The capture of the Ganj-i-Sawai in 1695, the chartering of the Adventure Galley in 1696, and the founding of the Bank of England in 1694 were not 3 separate events. They were part of the same financial moment. In 1694, England was bleeding silver. The 9 Years' War against Louis XIV was being fought in the Low Countries, where William's army had to be paid in coin. Every shilling that crossed the Channel did not come back. Worse, the old hammered silver still circulating at home, much of it dating from the reign of Elizabeth I, had been so heavily clipped around its edges that its actual silver content had fallen by perhaps half. Continental markets paid more for English silver as bullion than the Royal Mint paid for it as coin. Silver flowed out of the country as fast as English mariners could carry it. The Bank of England was chartered on July 27, 1694, specifically to raise war loans. But its founding created an institutional appetite for bullion that the country could not satisfy. Every ounce of foreign metal that could be brought into London became politically valuable. Every ounce that arrived through privateering against the French and Spanish, every ounce that arrived through the lawful East India trade, and every ounce that arrived through unlawful channels was, in the new monetary arithmetic of London, indistinguishable. On January 13, 1696, 12 days before the royal seal was affixed to Kidd's commission, Parliament passed the Act for remedying the ill state of the coin of the kingdom, the Great Recoinage. All clipped silver in the country was called in to be melted and reissued by weight to the old Elizabethan standard. Branch mints were opened at Bristol, Chester, Exeter, Norwich, and York. Between 1696 and 1700, the Royal Mint and its country branches would strike £6.8 million in new silver coin. In the 35 years before 1696, the Mint had coined $3.3 million in silver. The recoinage doubled the lifetime output of the English national currency in 4 years. In March of 1696, the Mint received a new warden. His name was Isaac Newton. The bullion that fed the recoinage came from everywhere. Some of it came from melted plate. Some came from foreign trade silver. Some came from Spanish-American pieces of 8 captured by English privateers and brought to London. And some of it, in quantities that the Mint records do not permit us to count exactly because the system was designed not to count them, came from the colonial fence ports of New York, Newport, and Philadelphia, where Indian Ocean pirate gold and silver was being melted, recast, and shipped to London. The infrastructure on the Atlantic side had been built by a single man. Adam Baldridge, an Englishman who had fled Jamaica in 1685 on a murder charge, had built a stone fortress on Ile Sainte Marie, the same small island off Madagascar where Kidd would later burn the Adventure galley. Baldridge had mounted 40 cannons on the wall. He had warehouses. He was supplied with rum and trade goods by the New York councilor Frederick Phillips, whose ships ran a regular trade circuit. Baldridge sold Phillips's rum to the pirates at £3 a barrel, having paid 1 shilling for it. Phillips's ships came home with gold. In New York, the gold was protected by Governor Benjamin Fletcher, who had personally accepted a frigate from the pirate Thomas Tew as a gift, and who had sold the same frigate on for £800. From New York, the gold was shipped to London. And in London, where the system became invisible, the gold was received by the Lombard Street goldsmiths. There were perhaps 40 of them. The principal names were these: Sir Francis Child of the Marigold on Fleet Street, knighted by William III, Member of Parliament, future Lord Mayor of London. Sir Richard Hoare of the Golden Bottle, also on Fleet Street, future Lord Mayor and personal banker to a generation of Tory peers. Sir Stephen Evance of Lombard Street itself, the most thoroughly entangled of the lot. Jeweler to the King, director of the East India Company, co-founder of the Hollow Sword Blade Company. A man born in New England and connected by trade and family to every Atlantic shipping route into the port of London. The goldsmiths operated their own private assay shops. Bullion arriving in any form, clipped coin, hammered plate, foreign mohurs, Spanish pieces of 8, was tested for fineness, weighed on the assay scales, recorded as a deposit at the agreed value, and melted into ingots that bore only the goldsmith's own mark. The smell of the assay furnace was charcoal and hot metal. The sound was the small hammer of the assayer on the touchstone. Once the receipt had been issued, the bullion's previous identity was gone. The paper notes the goldsmiths issued against these deposits circulated as ready cash. In 1695, the Court of King's Bench affirmed the doctrine. The notes of goldsmiths, the court ruled in the case of Tassel and Lee, are always accounted among merchants as ready cash and not as bills of exchange. That was the moment the goldsmith's paper became money. The thing the Whig Junto invested in was not a man with a cutlass. It was a chartered financial vehicle with the royal seal of England on its commission, designed to pump bullion out of the Indian Ocean and into the bottleneck of the Great Recoinage. The plunder of the Ganges Sawai, melted in a colonial fence and shipped through Lombard Street, was indistinguishable in an English shilling from the plate of an English country gentleman. That was the design. Back to Kidd. The political reckoning fell on the Whigs first. In 1699, while Kidd was sailing back across the Atlantic, the Tories took the Commons. Robert Harley, leader of the country Tories and the rising master of the House, scented blood in the Kidd voyage. He understood, before anyone else in the chamber understood it, that the Articles of Agreement of October 1695 could be used to bring down the entire Whig government. Kidd was arrested in Boston in July 1699. He had buried part of his remaining treasure on Gardiner's Island, off the eastern tip of Long Island, with the consent of John Gardiner, the proprietor. The inventory drawn up on July 17 in Gardiner's own hand listed 1,111 ounces of gold, 2,353 ounces of silver, and 17 ounces of jewels and precious stones. By the time the cash reached London, the figures had shrunk. 783 ounces of gold, 633 of silver. Someone in Bellomont's chain of custody had helped themselves. Kidd was shipped to England in chains aboard His Majesty's frigate Advice and committed to Newgate Prison in April 1700. The smell of Newgate was lamp soot and damp stone and the jail fever that was killing one prisoner a week. He was held there for over a year. The shackles left iron rust on his wrists. He was twice brought before the House of Commons in the hope that he would name his partners and bring down the junto. On the second occasion, on March 27, 1701, he was examined for several hours. He refused to name them. An anonymous member of Parliament, recorded in the parliamentary diaries of the session, was heard to say of Kidd as he was led out, "I had thought him only a knave. Now I know him to be a fool as well." He may not have been a fool. He may have been a man waiting to be saved by men who had promised to save him. From Newgate, in a narrative he wrote to the Lords Justices, and which survives in the Colonial Office papers at Kew, Kidd wrote, "I thinking myself safe with a king's commission and the protection of so many great men, accepted, thinking it was in my Lord Bellomont's power, as Governor of New York, to oppress me, if I still continued obstinate. Before I went to sea, I waited twice on my Lord Romney and Admiral Russell. Both hastened me to sea and promised to stand by me. They did not stand by him." The trial was held at the Old Bailey on May 8 and 9, 1701. Kidd was tried on 6 indictments, 1 for the murder of William Moore, 5 for piracy. The 2 French passes he had taken from the Quedagh merchant and the Rouperel, which would have established those captures as lawful prizes of war, were not in his possession. They were, it was later discovered, in the office of the Earl of Bellomont's secretary. They were withheld from him at trial. They were rediscovered in the Public Record Office in the early 20th century, misfiled in a separate bundle. He was without counsel until literally an hour or two before the trial began. He was convicted on every count. On May 23, 1701, he was carted from Newgate to Execution Dock at Wapping. The rope broke on the first attempt. He was hanged a second time. His body was carried downriver to Tilbury Point, and there hung in chains for 3 years as a warning to the merchant captains coming up the estuary. Darby Mullins, a poor Irishman who had sailed under Kidd, hanged beside him on the same beach. The impeachment proceedings against the Whig Junto were lodged in the Commons later that same season. Articles of impeachment were brought against Lord Somers, against the Earl of Orford, against Lord Halifax, and against the King's Dutch favorite Portland. The Duke of Shrewsbury had already resigned from office, citing ill health. The Lords stood by the impeached peers and acquitted them all in June of 1701. A petition from Kent, criticizing the Commons for spending its time prosecuting ex-ministers instead of preparing for war, was treated as a libel, and the men who presented it were jailed. By the time the next reign began, the Whig Junto was back in office. John Somers, who had affixed the Great Seal to Kidd's commission, returned to government in 1708 as Lord President of the Council under Queen Anne. He died in 1716 as Baron Somers of Evesham. His papers are now at the Hertfordshire Record Office. The portrait of him as Lord Chancellor hangs in the Royal Courts of Justice. Edward Russell, Earl of Orford, served again as First Lord of the Admiralty from 1709 to 1710. He died in 1727. Charles Talbot, Duke of Shrewsbury, returned to office as Lord Chamberlain. In 1714, in the last days of Queen Anne, he became Lord High Treasurer, the last commoner ever to hold the office. He died in 1718. Henry Sidney, Earl of Romney, whom Kidd had named in his prison narrative as one of the men who hastened him to sea, died in 1704 with his estate intact. Edmund Harrison, the front man on the articles, continued as a director of the new East India Company and died comfortably in the city. Sir Francis Child became Lord Mayor of London in 1698, sat in Parliament until his death in 1713. The bank that bore his name continued to trade. It survives into the 21st century. Sir Richard Hoare was knighted by Queen Anne in 1702, became Lord Mayor in 1712. The bank he founded, Hoare and Company, still operates from 37 Fleet Street. The 11th generation of the Hoare family runs it. It is the oldest privately owned bank in the United Kingdom. The ledgers from the 1700s are still in the bank's archives. Sir Stephen Evans, the man whose Atlantic connections most plausibly received the Indian Ocean gold, shot himself in 1712, reputedly because he had failed in the world. When his estate was settled, his debts were paid in full. The Hollow Sword Blade Company he had co-founded was bought out and converted into a joint stock bank that would later become the South Sea Company. Sir Isaac Newton, who from his post at the Mint had overseen the recoining of £6.8 million in silver between 1696 and 1700, was knighted in 1705 and remained Master of the Mint until his death in 1727. He was buried in Westminster Abbey. Roughly 8 common seamen were hanged at Execution Dock for the Indian Ocean trade of the 1690s. Kidd, Darby Mullins, 6 of Henry Every's men taken in Ireland and brought to London. None of them named the men who had funded them. Most of them have no graves. 37 Fleet Street, City of London. Today, the building looks much as it has looked for nearly 300 years. A small brass plaque, a black door, a trading floor inside that opens